All right.
All right.
Achterhoeren. Welkom. Joen oer. De takkomst van het voedselonderskip. En dat zullen we heel graag natuurlijk in het vriezen, maar ja, we binnen Pablo en Willem, die kent de ambitie, dus die volk hebben Pablo, dat is toch ingewikkeld. Dus let's talk in English tonight, so everyone can follow us a little bit. Very welcome here tonight. I'm going to start up, talk a little bit about introduction, and then Pablo and Willem will join us and give us a talk about the future of farmland worldwide. So hopefully we get inspired by them. So I would like to start. First of all, the context in which we are here is what we call Panorama 2028. It has to do with the regional future. We're looking again to what are we going to do the coming 10 years. We had last year the European Culture, a sort of regional mission. And there was a lot of public energy for that. But now we this 2018 is not there anymore. So we're losing our energy, but we start up some new things. So we need a new mission for our region. Panorama 2028 is about that, looking towards that new mission for our region. And we call this the Blue Delta. That's with a working name. It doesn't say a lot yet. It's going to be our destination in 10 years as a region. If you look at this picture, you will see that maybe this is how it got with. I have to ask Teunis. I think if it got with comes to the Netherlands. Does he see the Netherlands and the Frisian area like this? Probably it is. Okay. Anyway, what we try to do with the Panorama meetings is try to get idea of our next step for the coming 10 years region. And that's what we do in a public debate and public dialogue. And what we try to do is to look a little bit further than the coming 2-3 years, but have a little bit a picture from the sea, which is on the horizon for 10 years for this region. So therefore 2028. So on the other side of the road, there are people working on the political agenda. And what we try to do here is to do that with the people living in this area. And what we try to do from that point of view, we use the sustainable development goals as a way we look at our future. And that's what we do within the context of these activities like we do here. And within a few weeks, the people from the cultural capital again with a cultural program for the coming years. So they will hopefully work on the same society challenges as we are working on this side. And finally. What we saw now already is that we within our region there are, as we see it now, three themes which we would like to work on for coming years. That's where we start with. Theme one is about water, our relation with water in the region. The second theme is about circularity. And the third one is about the social part, broad prosperity, you could say, brede welvaart in Dutch. How are we going to do that within the region? So these are the themes we are going to work on for the coming half year at least. But tonight, if you would like to see some information about that, it's a Blue Delta and the program from what we do here this week. You can find it there. But tonight we have special guests. Willem Verda and Pablo Titanel. Because one of those themes for our future is, of course, our agricultural landscape which is around in the Frisian and northern area. So we would like to discuss that. And then from an international point of view, and Pablo was here 5 years ago. Who was there 5 years ago? With few people. It was very interesting meeting. Remember that in the Frisian Museum. Made a lot of impact on a lot of people. So hopefully you will do that again for the coming 5 years for us. So we're very grateful you're here. Hopefully you will give some inspiration on how we're going to change our agricultural landscape around us, inspired by ideas you give us. So I would like to ask you to come and tell us a story. I'll give you a microphone for that.
Thank you very much. That's it. Well, good evening, everyone. How's your Dutch? Is it good? Yeah. But otherwise I can do it in English if you prefer. Do it in English. Yeah, because we're in Friesland. No? All right. So let's talk about the future of farming in balance with the ecological boundaries. So this is what. Thank you very much. What this talk is going to be about. It's true. I was here 5 years ago, and I remember that very kindly. I think it was a very nice debate we had. And I hope I don't reiterate too much what I said already. So I try not. So I've been trying to look for that presentation to avoid that, but I didn't find it. So let's see what comes out. Today I come in a different quality. Before I was a professor in Wageningen University on farming systems ecology. Now I'm a professor at Groningen University, part-time professor. I'm also working in Argentina, so I have one foot there and one foot here. And of course always with projects in Africa and in other places. So you will see that also in the examples I'm bringing tonight. I'm going to talk about resilient landscapes, which is a little bit the topic of the chair. I was appointed in Groningen with the support of WWF, the Dutch office. Right. So this is a picture that many of you may recognize. It's strange to start talk about farming with such a picture because it's not about farming. But actually has a lot to do with farming because this is. Anyone knows what it is? This oil extraction from the sands, from tar-rich sands in the boreal area. Right? This is all destroying the tundra to produce oil, to extract drops of oil from these bituminous sands, that's what they're called, and that's to feed our economy, especially our agriculture. There's a very good book, 10 years old. That's called We're Eating Fossil Fuels. And it's likely because actually when we look at the energy balance that is there in a kernel of any grain produced in high input agriculture, 70% of that energy comes from fossil fuels. So we're literally depending on fossil fuels for our food. But it was not always like that. This is a recent development of the last 50 years. And so we are on time to do something about it. And we have to do something about it because one of the problems with fossil fuels is that they are not endless. Right? So we can't really rely on them forever. Beyond the destruction and the pollution that generates. This is a picture that comes from South America. It could be in Argentina, it could be in Brazil, Paraguay, in Bolivia, different places. And what we see here is deforestation, land use change, land conversion, forest conversion into agricultural lands. And all the carbon that's stored in those soils and that vegetation is actually exposed to the climate and is actually oxidated and lost CO2 contributing to global warming. Right? But right. And beyond that, those are places where people live. Indigenous people live in those places. And when you destroy the forest, you destroy their habitats. Right? Those are habitats for biodiversity. Important, very important ones. Right? And so those are images associated with agriculture and food production today. Most of the soybean or the maize produced in those fields does not feed people living around that area, but that feeds chicken or pigs somewhere else in the world. Right? And here we come to the planetary boundaries, which is a little bit the title that was proposed for this talk. The planetary boundaries are the area that determines the safe operating space for Earth as a global system. Right? In that system, we are societies are there, biodiversity is there, everything is there, and we have a certain amount of room for maneuvering in terms of what we can do with the Earth. But there are boundaries. We can't just do anything. Right? So how do we measure those boundaries? Well, we use indicators. In this case, we have 9 different indicators. Right? Like climate change, biosphere integrity, freshwater use, etc., ocean acidification, etc. Now, what you will notice there is that it works like a traffic light. Right? When you're in the green, you're okay. When you're in the yellow, you start worrying, or you should start preparing to stop. And when you're in the red, you should definitely stop doing what you're doing. Right? So what we see here is that there are three indicators for which we are in the reds already. Right? One is the loss of genetic diversity, loss of biodiversity, and the other one is the load of nitrogen and phosphorus. And these three indicators, these processes are highly associated with the way we do agriculture, and we produce food. So the question of agriculture and Earth sustainability is a very tight one. Right? Strong relationship there. However, when we look at that graph, we see that biodiversity loss is a much more urgent problem than climate change at the moment. But what we see here in this little graph in the corner is the number of times that biodiversity appears in the media and the number of times that climate change appears in the media. Is there a pointer here? So may I do this? Cameraman? May I do this? This is the number of times climate change appears in the media, and this is the number of times that biodiversity appears in the media. Right? So actually, of course, we all feel yesterday we had a major storm, and the first thing we say is climate change. Right? We feel it strongly. But if we look at the boundaries, we are in a much worse situation in terms of nature, in terms of biodiversity. Right? There was this report that came a few weeks ago, came out and says, there are five major drivers that determine biodiversity. We're talking about extinction of 1 million species. It's a lot, right? And those five drivers are changes in land use and sea use, exploitation of organisms like fishing or hunting, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. What are invasive alien species in common terms? They're not extraterrestrial. Right? What are they? What's the problem? A common problem here. I heard once there was this mussels in the sea in the Netherlands that take over. Right? Well, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Invasive alien species that are not from the place that become invasive. Right? We're not talking about people. Not extraterrestrial, no people either. Now, farming, as I said before, is one of the major drivers of biodiversity loss. Right? For many reasons, we can use very complicated names. I mean, we are including adding things, biotic elements to a place where an ecosystem where they were not there. We also removing some other elements. We're using chemicals, for example. We are altering the geochemistry of the area by using fertilizers based on fossil fuels. We're also altering hydrological cycles through water extraction, irrigation. We're altering habitats and we altering disturbance regimes. For example, when we incentivize fires through our floodings or extreme deforestation or things like that. However, most of the biodiversity is still in potential landscapes. Right? Biodiversity It's not only in the national parks or in the national reserves. Because national parks they comprise about 5% of the Earth's surface. Right? Only 5%. The rest is outside the national. That means that most of the biodiversity is still in production landscapes. If we want to conserve this biodiversity, we need to do something about those production landscapes. It's not just about we do whatever we want with our agricultural fields and we keep the protected areas. That doesn't work like that, right? To illustrate how farming practices affect biodiversity, I'm going to use a picture that I borrowed from Tönnies, from Jeroen Anrost, who I think he was presenting here a few weeks ago. They described a food web in a Dutch dairy farm. You know, a food web, a food pyramid, let's say, where you have all the primary producers, and then the herbivores, and then the predators, and the top predators. Right? So it's a complex web there. We don't talk about the pyramid. We talk about a web, something. And this is how it used to be on a farm, a dairy farm in the Netherlands. Right? Now what happens today? 50 or 70 years later, we have a situation like this. Very nice drawing. That's why I'm using it. I'm stealing it from. Very nice. Because it actually shows how dramatic it is. Right? When you actually change your base of your building, you're just simplifying your system. You're turning this into just a single species. And you even remove the cow as a grazer. You just use the tractor. Right? And so then it is not surprising that you see this loss of, for example, insect biodiversity in Europe by 70% as we saw. But it's not surprising, right? And because there are less insects, there are also less birds, and etc. So it's quite logical that we may expect these sort of results. Right? However, there's still some popular myths that justify this type of agriculture, right? And you must have heard about these myths. I put this list of myths a few years ago. And today, when I was preparing this presentation, I tried to review them. And I reviewed a few, but some of them are still there, still valid. I didn't have to change them a lot. So food is enough. It's just a matter of distribution. Yields need to increase, and production has to double by 2050. Further intensification is necessary to preserve nature. Let's get real. Only industrial farming can feed the world. Intensive animal production is better for environment. Preventing GMO cultivation in Africa is a crime against humanity. Have you heard that one? I heard very often. I heard. Agroecology is only viable for small scale or hobby farming. And so on. We could list more, actually. Well, let's see some data. See whether we can back up this statement with data or not. And this is I believe this is something that I shared last time I was here, because I remember the discussions a little bit. But this is an analysis which is quite simple. It basically relates the production of cereals at country level, the average productivity, the yields, with the total production at global level. Right? It's a counterintuitive. It looks like this. Why look like this? Well, because you see here we come to countries, and sorry for the cameraman, slowly moving here. So what each country has on average as yields, and the contribution this country has to the global is 0.2 of global population. Right? We're not saying that the Netherlands is not important for agriculture because it's an exporting country, it's a processing country, it's a technologies. But in terms of how much grain you produce to feed the world, I mean, you can actually do half of it will be okay, right? Or double it, lots of problems, and still not make a major difference. You see? So this is important. And now what's important here is actually this other corner, which is the yields, the countries that yield less than 2 tons per hectare. Countries that have poor yields on average. Right? On average, they have 1.3, and they produce 15%. Since 6,000 years ago. We're cereal eaters. So 80% of our calories in the form of cereals, in the form of bread, or in the form of meat, they come from cereals. Right? So we're almost like the koala. You know? The koala is specialized in one single species. Which one? Eucalyptus. The gum tree. Eucalyptus. Well, we are becoming a koala with maize. Most of our energy comes from maize, right? We're almost like a koala. So in those countries where we have 15% of the production, we have lots of people living there. And when we talk about these global figures of hunger, we say 800 million people are going hungry every year. Well, most of those people live in those countries. So if you ask me, where do we have to increase agricultural production? I would say, it's quite easy, right? Because first of all, people who are suffering from hunger are those living in those places where productivity is very low. And second, because from an environmental point of view, it's easier to double yields in an area low productivity than in an area of high productivity, right? And by doing that, you also create more incomes, more economy growth for those regions as well. So the question is, what sort of model of agriculture can work in those situations? Because the one we have here doesn't work there, right? We did calculation. I'm not going to go into numbers, but actually this is the scope. Yeah? If we divide all these countries into groups, low yield group up to the high yield group, actually the ones on the left are the ones with the potential to actually increase production in a reasonable way. That should be our target. But when we talk about production, we often talk about calories. We're talking about cereals, right? But we humans need more than calories. Right? And when we talk about food security, yes, of course, availability is important, but also access. You may be in a place in which there's a lot of availability, but you, as an individual, have no access because there is all sort of political issues had to do with equity, with poverty, etc. Access, stability over time, and also utilization. Utilization has to do with the capacity of our bodies to use those calories. Right? In many parts of the world, people are not able to cook one warm meal a day, right? Because they don't have energy, they don't have firewood. Right? So energy security goes alongside food security. Yeah? Utilization has to do with nutrition. You may get a lot of calories, but if you don't have a balanced diet, you're not able to absorb that. Isn't it, doctor? Am I right? Right? So nutrition is part of food security as well, right? A balanced diet. Since we're talking about a balanced diet, I would also like to share with you the last context picture I would like to share, because I was asked not to talk about problems, but more about solutions, but I can't help it. So the last one is about nutrition, and it's about what we need to eat. So we say, okay, we need to increase production, but what do we need to produce more of what? So doctors, medical doctors, nutritionists, they came together a few years ago and they came up with this paper where they calculated what should be the ideal diet to minimize the deaths that are human deaths associated with diet, right? Diet-related diseases. So a balanced diet that has a number of items as main ones. And what we have here, what we see in the picture, the yellow bars, is what we are producing at the moment at global level, right? And what we have here, the blue line, is what we need at global level. Taking into account cultural differences, because we don't all eat the same or at the same rates, right? So what we need for a balanced diet and what we produce. So for example, if we look at grains, whole grains, we're producing 54% more than what we need. Vegetables, we're producing 11% less. Nuts and seeds, we're producing about half of what we need. And nuts and seeds and fruits are tree crops. So we will need more space for trees. Where are we going to put them? Well, one solution is to mix them with the current crops through what we call agroforestry. Here are some examples of that for different sort of scales. One picture is from Africa, the other one is from France, the other one is from England, I think. And milk, we need to produce 55 or 50% more milk. Not in Friesland, sorry. Not in Friesland only. Otherwise, you will be exporting water all the time, right? Sorry, very good fla. That one you can export it to Argentina. The fla, that one, yes. But the rest, no. So we need to think about livestock dairy production systems that are adapted to the conditions where people need more milk, right? Like this one in Kenya. Fish, we know about this. We know that we're overfishing. And of course, everyone gets excited when I get to these points. That's why I put it in red. Red meat. This is a big winner. It's 5 times more than what we need, right? We're producing 5 times more than what we need for a balanced diet. Yeah. And every time we hear people talk about food production in the future, everyone starts from, well, some developing countries are getting more money and they're going to use more or that to buy meat, right? So we need to increase meat production. It's an assumption, right? But we're already producing 5 times more than what we need. So we need to change that. We need to adjust our behavior in terms of consumption. So how, since I mentioned agroforestry, I wanted to show some pictures. These are all pictures that come from Europe. These are all agroforestry systems, some of them traditional, some of them current ones, all from Europe. So agroforestry is not new to Europe. It existed before. It's and in many places it's still there, like the Dehesa system in Spain, etc. This is compiling this book. It's already 10 years old. And then when we think about these sort of possibilities, how about, since we are in Friesland, how about thinking about a future Dutch dairy farming that includes trees? That includes trees that can actually produce fodder, high quality fodder, fix nitrogen from the air, and actually replace a little bit of the protein that is being imported in the soybean that comes from Brazil, from the Amazon. Why not thinking a little bit outside the box of what are the possibilities to design more intensive but ecologically intensive systems also for the dairy sector, right? We need to actually certainly think outside of the box. So this is a good point to ask ourselves, what is agroecology? Because I've been saying a lot of things, but I've been avoiding this term, which is actually I would say my specialty, my profession, what I know is agroecology, right? That's my discipline, agroecology. And agroecology is this combination of designing agricultural systems using the principles of nature, the principles how ecosystems work, right? But including the people. In agroecology, the people are at the center of the system. Is it nature-inclusive agriculture? Well, yes, it could be, right? It certainly will include nature, right? But nature-inclusive agriculture is not enough, right? Because we may have a farm where we do whatever we want, and then in one corner we put the nature. It includes nature, but it's not what we mean, right? So perhaps it's better to say it's nature-driven agriculture. Right? It's agriculture that needs nature to work, to function, right, to produce. So one example that I showed here, I'm sure, because we were starting 5 years ago, was this, in which we look at traditional systems of rice with duck and fish, and this algae, this azolla, in Indonesia, where we use traditional knowledge and traditional systems, but we combine that with current knowledge and current technologies to optimize these systems, right? These systems are interesting because these are complex food web. Right? When you not have only just rice, but you also have fish and duck, and they will feed on the weeds, the uncrowd. They will feed on the snails. They will feed on the maggots. So they will control pests and weeds, right? And this is a picture that is very common in any book about crop diversification, which is as you make the system more complex, the yield of rice increases because of these positive synergies between these complex systems, right? The components of this complex system, right? Now, what is interesting here is that in the most complex system, you produce rice, but you also produce eggs and fish and meat, etc. So it's really more interesting also from an economic perspective. We spent 5 years looking into climate issues, whether this will enhance or not greenhouse gas emissions, and it doesn't necessarily, depending on how you manage. I'm not going into that. Let me just go quickly. But I want to show this one, because this one represents a little bit the way we reason when we think about agroecology. We go beyond yields. We're not thinking only about how many tons of rice we produce. We're thinking about how many people we can feed. And we can do that calculation by taking into account calories. How many calories I produce, how many do people need, right? And compare systems. But here, interestingly, we also did it with vitamin A, or with zinc, or with iron, to see how many people we can feed with these systems, right? And if we compare the most complex systems, I'm moving again slowly to this corner, the one that has rice and fish and everything, with a conventional system with fertilizers and pesticides and everything else, what we see is that in terms of energy, they produce more or less the same, but in terms of nutrients, it produces less, and in terms of vitamin A, it doesn't produce anything, right? Because we know Southeast Asia has a problem with lack of vitamin A because they eat rice 3 times a day, and rice doesn't have vitamin A, right? So beyond thinking about biofortification of vitamin A or GMOs or anything like that, why not growing a more diverse patch where you can have also papayas or anything else, carrots, that provides that vitamin A, right? These sort of solutions. Now, but this example, which is a very nice example, it's only possible thanks to people. Thanks to the people driving this case. The whole village is organized, and they're all certified organic using a certification, which is participatory guarantee system, right? And they market the rice in the local market as organic, right? It's not thinking about exporting organic rice to Japan or to Europe or Australia. It's thinking about producing for the local market. So this example I showed before is an example that works very well on a tiny farm in Indonesia, right? But it may also be taken to these large-scale farms, for example, in Argentina, where we have situations like this, but on 900 hectares. So large operations, mechanized, with less human labor available, but still with very good use of the interaction, the positive synergies that can take place between these components, right? So agroecology is not only applicable to small-scale farming. The same principle that you do there, you can apply them to other scales, right? It's only that you have to change a little bit and redesign the system because it doesn't work in the same way. I'm going to do something very daring. I'm going to take this. It's really hot here. Are you also a bit? Thank you. Oh. Thank you very much. So this is also the result. Well, in this case, I'm using a local species, which is important because if it escapes, it may become an invasive alien species if it wasn't local. So that's an important element of this system that should be local. And also water recycling is an important element of this system because the nutrients, that are left after the fish and the rice can be reused for a next rice crop. So all these technologies are necessary, right? It's a different scale than the case that I was showing before, but the principles are the same. The circularity of agriculture, in this case, is the same. Right? Good, anyway. Agroecology has shown impact in terms of improving yields. This is, I'm not going to go into this because it's a table with lots of numbers, but basically it's a study that was done a few years ago where they studied a lot of projects taking place in Africa and implementing different elements of agroecology and looking at the yield increase capacity and the number of hectares that were intervened. So agroecology is already beyond the small experimental plot or a tiny, nice farm. It's also something that has impact at scale. And I don't know where to point. Well, something went wrong there. There also. Agroecology is not new. Agroecology came up as a scientific discipline in the years 30s, in the 30s, right? And later on it became a practice. Many farms in the North America, influenced by people like Aldo Leopold or Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry was a farmer and a philosopher. They started doing this sort of farming with nature, right? And then later on, agroecology became a social movement associated with other claims, like also the campesino movement, the claim for land, et cetera, right? So that's why when we define agroecology, we talk about three pillars: science, practice, and movement, right? It's hard to understand agroecology if we don't consider the three, right? Good. So agroecology has been flagged mostly by the Latin American Society for Agroecology that exists already for 25 or 30 years, that has contributed to the global debates, and has been taken up by national research institutes like the INRA in France or the INTA in Argentina, which are very traditional institutes. So, but it's being taken serious, and it's becoming a reality in those situations. And of course, it's associated with, as I said before, the campesino movements, right? Now, one of the major challenges we have to feed the world, if you remember the picture I showed earlier, that corner, that 15%, that agriculture is poorly yielding because it's taking place in landscape like this, which are highly degraded. This is an agricultural landscape. What we see there are little patches of crops already coming out at the beginning of the rainy season. The piles there are piles of manure. So this is an actively used agricultural landscape, right? Very degraded. And through agroecology, through regenerative agriculture, using the principles of agroecology, you can get this situation. And I'm sure the villain is going to show very exciting examples as well. Here I put the name of the farmer because if any of you happen to be in Mali and want to visit, you know, this is not a scientific paper, this is a real person. You can go and see that this is true, right? And see his neighbors are still having. And this transformation is possible. I mean, of course it takes time, it takes dedication, it takes knowledge, it takes support, but it's possible, right? It's possible to turn this land back into production, into very diverse production as we see here. And the knowledge generated in this process is now shared with other farmers. So this farmer, Umar, is now training other farmers to do the same. For example, here in the picture, showing how he does his anaerobic compost, mixing with animals, preparing bales, and producing very healthy crops with high nutritional value, right? All this is based on the idea of design. Agroecology relies on design principles, right? That's where agroecology gets very close or has a lot in common with permaculture, which is basically a design-driven discipline, right? So I would say agroecology is a little bit, is the science behind all these different initiatives, like food forest or permaculture or things like those. So one of the things we talk about loss of biodiversity, and one of the things that we need to consider is that an important element of biodiversity that we lose is soil biodiversity. So here what we see is also a network, also a web, a food web I would say, of different organisms in the soil. Different colors of these circles represent different types of organisms, and the lines between them is how do they relate with each other, right? When we turn this forest into a pasture land, we lose quite some diversity. But when we turn this into a soybean field, we lose a lot of diversity. Now, this is something that we don't see. We just drive on the road and we just see the soybean, but we don't see the damage we are generating in these soils. And especially because, well, that system is now dependent on external nutrients, on external inputs, on fertilizers, and is much more vulnerable to climate change or to any variation, fluctuation in climate, right? In ecology, we talk about functional redundancy. Redundancy, it's an important element of the resilience of the system. Here, we lose redundancy, which is an important property of systems to be resilient, for example, to climate change, right? So how do we restore these soils again? This comes from coastal areas of Peru, a very dry area, and I'm so hot now that I feel like I'm there almost. And I'm going to propose you to take a little rest from your position and to perhaps, if you like, to just stand up 1 second. Right. And to stretch a little bit. If anyone has a joke, welcome. No? All right. Well, thanks. You may sit or you may remain standing if you want. Or lay down, no problem. Sorry for the... I'm sure you can edit this out later on. But now we're awake again. So this is an area where when I went there for the first time, I asked farmers, how much does it rain here? And they'll say, it doesn't rain here, right? You will see houses with no roofs, right? People living like that because it doesn't rain. It rains in the mountains behind, and sometimes you get some rivers which are intermittent. Now, these farmers there are using that little water to create this sort of oasis, combining trees and crops and livestock. Not cows, no? But livestock. Oh, thank you very much. And so they use the disposals to produce compost, to produce biogas. And when we look at the diversity of those soils, we are soil scientists, so we're going to look into bichos, into insects, there, bugs. So what we find is much more diversity in a maize crop in that sort of soil because of all this work people do. So they actually build soil fertility, right? So there is more diversity in the soil that is cultivated than in the natural soil, right? This is built soil fertility through management. Yeah. But this can also be done at different scales. Many of you may have seen these very strange machines. This example, you know this example? This farmer from Zeeland. Well, he's a wheat farmer. He's receiving a prize there for having the biggest wheat plant ever. Yeah. He's a very good farmer. He produces 8-9 tons of wheat without fertilizers, organically, right? He's a very good farmer. And to be able to achieve that, he does a lot of experimentation. His farm has 18 different crops. So this picture is not a good one, right? It's not showing diversity, but it shows his very strange machines that he developed himself. He adapted the technology, precision agriculture, to be able to do his intercrops and reach those high yields with agroecology, right? So it's also possible with high tech. It's actually necessary with high tech and experimentation. I'm not going into this. This is another farmer nearby here in Groningen province, a young one, and those are my students from Wageningen, visiting his cover crops and looking at how he did that combination of crops to restore fertility of his soils, also without using fertilizers. A young farmer. This is some of the work we do. I'm going quickly because I don't have, as usual, I'm running out of time, of the work we do at the landscape level, because many of the functions that we need in agroecology, for example, natural enemies of pests, they need a habitat. So we need to create landscapes with habitats. This picture is from Argentina. And that those enemies of pests may also be birds. Yeah? Those birds are also very important in controlling pests in the landscape, right? And so this is the sort of material we try to develop to convince farmers of doing this. How can you design your farm with more trees to have more functions, right? It's not easy because when you work at the landscape level, you're not working only with one farmer. We're working with a consortium, a community, and you need to convince the community to work together to create corridors, to create biodiversity spots for example, pest control, right? So these are some of the incipient work we're doing with communities to try to work at the landscape level. Working at the landscape level is not, ecologically speaking or technically speaking, is not so much of a challenge, but socially speaking is a very important challenge, right? Good. Now, how do we get there? Because so far I've been using examples, interesting example, isolated example from here and there, but how do we get to scale? How do we stream out this? Well, how do we become mainstream with agroecology? So for that, I'm going to use this graph that is, many of you may be familiar with it. It's been developed by a school of thought here in the Netherlands that talks about transitions and innovations. So this thing here, this band represents what we call a social technical regime where everything is happening. For example, if we talk about how is milk being produced in the Netherlands, well, we can describe it. It has a certain characteristics. We describe the production, we describe the value chain, we describe the transport, the consumption, and all that is here, right? Interconnected. That's what we call the social technical regime. Every now and then, there are innovations that appear and enter the regime, right? How do we listen to music? Well, before, we will use a Walkman or a Discman or an iPod. Now we use Spotify. Well, that is what we call the social technical regime, and those innovations, every time there is an opening, they come up and they become part of the mainstream, right? And there is also these global trends or national trends that actually affect the social technical regime, and there are feedbacks. No? So what happens elsewhere in the world, or let's say large-scale migration, human migration has influences on this, for example, or trading or things like those. Now, using this, is it clear? Yeah. What is? Thank you. Yes, I'm finalizing with the next picture. Because I think we are now in a situation in which we can describe it like this, right? Where the global situation is very turbulent, right? Even the Pope is talking about the environment, right? Unprecedented, right? So there is a lot of signals that people are worried about food, they're worried about the environment, and there is a lot of turbulence. And that turbulence, societal turbulence, creates a lot of openings. And innovations such as agroecology have more and more opportunity to become part of the mainstream, right? So we can actually leave it like this and let it happen, or do as, for example, they do in the IT business, which is to create what we call innovation platforms, Silicon Valleys, full of agroecological farms that can actually support this process, right? Well, with that idea in mind, thinking about the future of farming in the region, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Pablo. Before you go away, and of course, you stay a while, but what did you see changing in the last 5 years in the Netherlands? Because you were 5 years ago in this area, and you're now back in the Netherlands after a period in Argentina. Did you see some change?
Well, yeah. I mean, that turbulence has to do with the type of change I saw here, right? Mm-hmm. For example, 5 years ago, you had to explain a lot of the problems to people, mm-hmm. and try to convince that change was necessary. Mm-hmm. And then we started discussing what sort of change. I think we are now gone further, and people are aware of the change of the problems. There are positions which are not defendable anymore, and it's clear it's not defendable anymore. And so there is more opening for these kind of things. I mean, I'm happy to learn, for example, that even the province, or the northern provinces, are actually supporting climate or let's say nature-inclusive agriculture, or things like those. Yeah. Yeah.
It wasn't 5 years ago. It was even a new discussion. Now it is almost common to talk about nature-inclusive farming, new ways of farming. So that's good. Thank you very much, Pablo. In the end, we will of course have questions for Pablo, but I would like to ask Willem to join us to talk about how is he working with this common land organization? He will probably explain a little bit about himself. Working on restoration or for landscapes throughout Europe as well. So he will give us, I think, hopefully a method on how we can change landscapes, so that hopefully inspires us as well. Willem, here we have the microphone, and use it because otherwise our live stream followers can't hear.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for being here and talking after this great presentation on agroecology of my colleague. Maybe I can say that. I'm not a professor, but Paolo, thank you very much. Do I have something where I can... Oh, maybe it's here. Yeah.
It's over there.
That would be fine. Yeah, maybe they can change the sheets. Okay. So I will briefly introduce myself. I'm an ecologist, a tropical ecologist. I'm from Amsterdam. I have a Frisian background, but my father decided to fall in love with a Dutch Amsterdam girl. So that's why I was raised in Amsterdam. I don't speak Frisian, so I apologize for that. I studied ecology, tropical ecology, in South America. I specialized in ecosystem restoration and agriculture, and the interaction between agriculture and the conversion of ecosystems for agricultural systems. Then I came back, and finally, after a small career in ecotourism, I became involved in IUCN and ended up as a director of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the Dutch office, and have been working in conservation projects worldwide for many, many years. And then I decided to leave the conservation world and started after a sabbatical with Common Land. That was 7 years ago. And 7 years ago, I traveled around the world, quit with my job. A bit tough. I had a family, house, and a hypothèque. And decided to interview farmers in 15 countries, as well as investors. Because as you said, we need a system change. And if we want to have a system change, we need money and good ideas. Maybe first good ideas and then money to implement it. And so I decided to actually interview farmers worldwide. And poor farmers and rich farmers in the United States, in the UK, in Poland, in Holland, in Spain, in Ghana, in South Africa, in India, in El Salvador, in Ecuador, in India, in Turkey, in all those places. And I basically asked him 2 questions. The first question was, what frustrates you most? And the second question was, what is your dream? And I did the same thing with investors in Frankfurt, in London, in New York, and in Amsterdam. Same 2 questions. And now I will start my presentation. Then I will give you an answer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this holistic approach to landscape restoration based on business cases and about my experiences. And I've called it 4 returns. I will come back to that. So very brief. This on the right, you see the socio-economic trends over the last decades. It goes up everywhere. And on the left and on the right, you see the Earth system trends, and it goes up everywhere as well. More tropical forest loss, more marine fish capture, more shrimp agriculture, more nitrogen to the coastal zone. All these things we have been heard also from you. So these are the 2 trends, and that's why ecology and economics are very much interrelated. What does that mean? That means that societal needs extend beyond traditional definitions of corporate responsibility and sustainability. Doing less bad is not enough. We know that. And we know that especially after the many, many reports we have seen on ecosystems and biodiversity over the last few years, last month, you mentioned it. But many of these reports came out over the last decades. But the interesting fact was, this report last month has reached a lot of attention, and I loved your graph about it. Much more than I ever could dream about in my life, actually. As an ecologist in general, if you are an ecologist more than 30 years, you're getting used to to not be taken very seriously. So So we're living in a very beautiful time, a transformational time. So let's now go to the real stuff. Approximately 1/4 of the world ecosystems are degraded due to human activity. Sorry for the word activity, yes. Conversion, overgrazing, infrastructure, deforestation, overexploitation, efficient agriculture, climate change, pollution, all these things are causing the degradation of our ecosystems. And we know that. And it has been increased a lot after the Second World War. We call that the Great Acceleration. You can find those places everywhere in the world. In Europe, in many, many places. Many deserts are very degraded. Look at Syria, a very degraded place. The ecosystem crisis is very severe. It was a steppe system. It wasn't a desert. So we know these reports now. We know the attention. And there some changes had been caused also due to the Paris Climate Agreement a few years ago. That was a major tipping point, you could say. And now we even have the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration that will start in 2020, I think, or 21. For 10 years, the UN will focus on ecosystem restoration. And all the big countries agreed with it. China, the United States, you name it. The Netherlands, Russia, they all agreed with this topic. But agreeing with the topic and doing it is of course a big thing. So let's look into what can you do. And I think agroecology is one of the key issues, and I will come back to it, but maybe I will use different words, so I'm sorry for that. But I'm sure we're talking a little bit the same. So landscape restoration and management, sustainable management, will solve a lot of the major world's problems. Migration, climate change, biodiversity loss, poverty, security, floods, pollution, droughts, all these things that we are reading in the newspaper almost every day, if you read the right newspapers. So look into what happened and are there big examples that we can use. So when I left my job in 2012 as a conservationist, I was already very well aware of a very large World Bank program in China. I met a guy called John D. Liu. He became a friend of me in 2009, and he filmed and documented the Lus Plateau since 1994, when this first started. The Lus Plateau is a huge area in the middle of China, near the Yellow River, the size of France. And the Chinese realized that they need to do something about the erosion of this huge area that was deforested for decades. Under Mao's time, and of course before that, it already has been started with overgrazing and deforestation, the normal trend. And they started to reforest that area. And they did it in the Chinese way, very efficient. Not always the right species, but they did it. And now the size of Belgium has been restored, 3.5 million hectares, almost the size of the Netherlands in, now, let's say 25 years. And they just continue, they just do it. This is the Chinese way. They really do what they say. And I've been there several times, and it's amazing what happened. Many things and many social things were solved. Women have jobs, they have better education, a diversity of crops instead of only cereals and cutting of trees and goats. So a lot of things happened there. And the water streams came back, less erosion, less mud in the Yellow River, so no problem with dams anymore, and hydrogen and hydropower, and so on and so on. So this was amazing, and if you look at the size from the satellites, you can see the difference as well. Look at this, above and below. So this is possible. It is possible to restore large-scale degraded ecosystems. And of course, it will not be the Chinese old-growth oak forest that will come back. They used American robinia, but it doesn't matter. It is a good step. And the oak forest, by the way, is already coming up because the seed bank is still there. Isn't that interesting? So what can we learn from this? One lesson is, it is possible. The second lesson is, China has one landowner. And that makes it more easier because you only have to discuss with some Chinese officials to make this happen. While, look here in the Netherlands or in Spain, we have many, many landowners. So the land tenure issue is a real issue here. We need to think about how to bring the stakeholders together and make sure that we can do these big things so that we are all aligned for working for millennia, for decades to make this happen. And that's why I decided to, when I read about this, I thought, is it possible to create one universal model with one language that will unite farmers, authorities, investors, and other people living on the land, and finally also consumers and people who buy stuff, to work on this with a language they can use everywhere. A framework, you could say. That didn't exist when I started working here. There were a lot of good frameworks from the scientific point of view, but no one was reading those books. And they were so good and so perfect and so complex that no one understood it. So I wanted to find out, can we work towards one language and one framework? So that's why I went to those farmers and interviewed them. And because large investable landscape restoration initiatives are almost non-existent with the exception of China and maybe some other examples. And my quest was creating a practical framework that enables scaling up for all. And with a lot of innovation, this is tough. As you can see in the cartoon, this really is an innovative approach, but I'm afraid we can't consider it. It has never been done before. That's what you normally get when you come with these kind of examples. So we need one approach to restore and sustainably manage our landscapes. It doesn't exist. So I went to those farmers, as I said before in my introduction, and on the first question, what is your frustration? They said, my biggest frustration is that I cannot hand over my land in a better condition as I have received it before. That was everywhere the same. Wherever wealthy farmers, poor farmers, it didn't matter. And on their dream, basically they said, my dream would be that I get paid for a productive landscape that gives me the opportunity to also maintain it in a very good condition and make it more beautiful. You could say, to do the role of a stewardship. With the investors, it was different. The investors said, my biggest frustration is that I don't have pipeline. My projects are just, I can't find pipeline. I can't find real sustainable projects. They don't exist. There are a lot of projects that are doing less harm, less CO2 emissions, a little bit less pollution, these kind of things, a little bit better social welfare and these kind of things. But I can't find good projects projects that are doing good. And my frustration is also that I cannot share that with my kids because my kid, the next generation, is telling me that I'm earning money by taking away their future. So they had tough conversations at the table of the investors, and that was a typical, you could say, a generation problem. The younger generation wanted to have a new economic system while Dad was still working in the old economic system, although he was doing his best. So how to continue with these two things? I tried to talk and meet, and I met a lot of beautiful people, people who could inspire me. And there are many, many inspirational people. I've been always very much inspired by a lot of indigenous people. I lived with them in Colombia, where I studied and worked. But these people are almost all business people, 3 of them. Ray Anderson was the CEO of Interface, a large international carpet producer. He died a few years ago. Chris and Doug Tompkins, they founded the North Face and Esprit. Ibrahim Aboulais was the CEO and owner of a very large company in Egypt, where he started to regenerate and restore, let's say, a desert system with regenerative agriculture. I met those 3 people. I didn't meet Arden Naas. He is a philosopher and a biologist, a Norwegian guy. And he was the founder of the deep ecology movement, where ecology and, you could say, purpose is coming together. Chris and Doug are strange people. They use their capital to buy land in South America and then restored it, conserved it, and give it back to the governments as a protected area. Can you imagine? Ray Anderson said once, when we met him, we brought him to Holland a few years ago. He said, you know, if you are just here for a few moments on this beautiful planet, you can do two things: destroy it or restore it and conserve it, basically. That's what you can do. And that's what he did with his company. He really transformed his entire company. And Ibrahim Aboulais taught me a lot about, basically, you know, it's not about agriculture, it's not about ecology, it's not about biodiversity. Actually, it's only about people. It's about people. So beautiful people. And I started to work on my, you could say, my framework. And that framework should be systemic, long-term, be based on business cases, on agriculture, biodiversity, all these kind of things. Basically, it should move away from ego to an eco kind of framework. From top-down, hierarchical system with people working in silos to a kind of holistic circular system. And that was difficult, so I looked into the literature again, and I found this beautiful book of Daniel Weil and others, where they were talking about, moving away from the degradation system, the degradation economy, towards the regeneration economy, where you do all kinds of things to restore the ecological functionality of the planet. And that means, for me, when I look back to systems, moving away from maximization of financial returns per hectare to a system where you have maximization of ecological functions per hectare. Now, I think you recognize it. So that's why I started to work towards this framework. On the one hand, you have the business world, and the business world, I'm also an executive fellow at the Rotterdam School of Management, a business school in Rotterdam of the Erasmus University. So maximization of return on investment is what you learn there. But if you add 2 words per hectare, you create all those systems: deforestation, desertifications, biodiversity loss, climate change. Well, if you look to nature, you see that maximization of the interaction between species and biomass and anorganic material, that provide the basis of what we call ecosystem services, the things that we humans can use: food, water, carbon, oxygen, environmental security, all these kind of things. So how can you bring these 2 systems together? I tried it, and I thought, okay, if you go to a degraded area, you basically find 4 losses. People have lost their hope and purpose. People have lost their jobs. The natural system lost biodiversity, topsoil, water, vegetation cover quite often. And the whole economic system is gone. The people who live in those areas, they migrate, they go away. They go away from the interior of Australia to the cities. They go away from the rural areas of Spain to the cities. They go away from the Sahelian areas to Europe. So that's what's happening everywhere. And quite often this is causing a lot of conflict. So 4 losses, we need to solve these 4 losses. And because the word return came back in all the conversations I had with farmers, with investors, with scientists, I thought the key word is return. Investors know exactly that return. They always talk return. They talk about actually 3 words: risk, return, and double digits. That's their mantra. And of course, short term. 4 things. And they talk always with their own experts, of course. So the word return was key. And I thought, okay, if the word return is key, we need to go from a maximization of return on investment per hectare to 4 returns per hectare. First, we need to inspire, bring back the inspiration to the countryside. Return of inspiration. Second, we need to have more jobs in the rural areas, bring people back. Social jobs, social capital, return of social capital. Third, we need to restore and maintain and conserve the biodiversity, return of natural capital. And third, if we do that well, we will bring down the risks to make sure we get a sustainable financial model so we can produce and bring down the risks. 4 returns. But of course, 4 returns alone is nothing. We need to lend it, get grounded. So we grounded it in a way in zoning. Every ecologist knows what a zone is. We have a lot of ecological zones. So I decided to use the word of zone to make sure that people would understand how to work in a large landscape. And we basically have we need 3 zones. We need an economic zone where we produce, where there's infrastructure and cities and so on. We need to have a natural zone because that is the place where the foundation of biodiversity is needed to make sure that water and biodiversity is maintained and produced, and where we have also recreation and all these things. But what is more tougher, and what we see in countries like the Netherlands, but in many countries in the world, there's almost no combined zone. And this is the place of the agroecology. This is the place of the regenerative agroforestry. This is the place where you work with nature to produce for the long term. I call that the combined zone. And those 4 returns delivered by 3 zones can only work if you add another component, and that is time. Normally, people work in a time frame of a few years, 4 years, 5 years, with the exception of family offices and families and farmers, and sometimes investors. So I added the component of a generation, 20 years. 4 returns are delivered by a 3-zone approach at the landscape level during a minimum period of 20 years. And I worked it out in KPIs, key performance indicators, because that's important to monitor it. And I combined it with the zone and, published it. And that was the theory. So let's start and go into practice, because this is about doing it. I published it. The booklet is here. You can find it on the website at the Erasmus University and at IUCN, because we need first to have the basis. And then I started doing it. Brought the team together, started Common Land in 2013 and 14, and looked into how can we do this, do a very clear scouting, where can we find the right places to do this, where the people are in crisis, where you have a good ecological situation, where but it's very degraded, where you have a certain kind of productivity. And we started to build landscape restoration partnership with people. And after that, we started to, with those people, we started to work at the design. Where are the zones? And then what kind of business cases do we need that are regenerative, are productive, are pro-biodiversity? And where can we find the money? Basically, those steps we decided to do. So let me explain to you how that worked. At this moment, after 5 years, we are working in 4 large countries, 4 large landscapes. 1 million hectares in Spain, that is a quarter of the size of the Netherlands, where we set up a landscape restoration partnership and a company already. We set up a landscape restoration partnership that already existed, but we worked with them in South Africa in a water catchment of Port Elizabeth, 500,000 hectares, and we set up 2 companies. And then together with Australians, we set up a company in Australia, and now we work also towards a landscape partnership. And also recently we started to work in the Netherlands with a lot of other actors like Natuurmonumenten and farmers. So let me focus on Spain to explain how that works. But first, you need to understand that we need to bring people together. And how do you do that? How do you bring all kinds of different people together? You need to find a kind of way of methodology, how to inspire people and make sure that they all go to the same common goal, and that for many, many years to come. And that is tough, especially in places where, and in many countries where there's a lot of polarization going on. Left, right, poor, rich, whatever you name it. But still there's a common denominator, and that is the return of inspiration. And we have found out that if you talk about the real things of life, people are connected to it. And then they can co-create a new way of working. So that's what we did in Spain. And we used this model. It is called Theory U. It was developed by the MIT in the United States, a German called Otto Scharmer. And this model came from the business world, where they want to also to align all kind of way of working. And actually this model is about dreaming. And basically what we did it in all those places, and we also did it in the Netherlands. We called it the yield of tomorrow. You can find that on the web. And there are more than 85 people now in the whole of the Netherlands working with making this happen. And you work together, you come together, you design landscape together, and you design a common goal. So that's what we did also in Spain. So in Spain, we started in 2014. And we asked the first group of farmers, 30 farmers, the first farmers who really wanted to participate, how should that landscape of you look like in 2034? And we sat around the table, circle, and we discussed it and talked about it, and we explained the zoning model, and we stepped, we brought them up as a satellite. You could say from the tractor view to the helicopter view to even the satellite view. And farmers are basically working at the tractor view level, and they were amazed. They all said basically the same thing. Listen what they said. This is the figure, what they wrote down in Spanish, but because a lot of Frisians don't speak Spanish, for the exception, of course, with our Argentinian guests, I've translated it into English. Sorry, not in Frisian, but in English. So they said, we want a green, revitalized landscape. We want an agroforestry as a way of life. We want that the mountains and the altiplano, the high plains, will be the green lungs, and that solidarity, active community, will be in a cooperation way of alliances. We need to feel the community. We want to have the kids back and the swimming pool open again. And they said, we want actually a healthy population of abundance with professional agriculture. That means a different agriculture that they were doing, monocultures with pesticides so far. They want honest communication. They want to have a different mentality, different political and business mentality. They want to have citizens working together to go to their place and see what they're doing. They wanted to use the good way of technology, and they needed more leadership. And they also said something interesting. They said, we want to do this in the Altiplano, and we want to be in Spain the reference point of a new world. Interesting. They were proud. And they wanted to connect to other places in the world, or for returns. But basically what they said, and they wrote it down, ecology is economy. And then you may wonder, if you go back to the slide, you see a small little elephant there in the right corner. Do you see it? What is that? I mean, elephants haven't been there for millennia. So this elephant, what does that elephant mean? The elephant means, and they said, do you know that story of those people who can't see, blind people? And if you put an elephant in the room with a lot of blind people, they try to find out what it is. And someone else, no, this is a kind of a large, well, what's it called? A tail. So it's probably to brush something. This is the large paw, so that maybe it's a tree. So they didn't, but if you work together, they will find out that it was an elephant. So that was the elephant story. So basically, what they did is that they wrote their future down into a plan. 4 returns, 3 zone, 20 years plan. And then we started executing it. We raised money, and we started doing it. 1 million hectare, more than 150,000 people. Now more than 240 members of this farmers association, including governments, local governments, and protected area managers, and local entrepreneurs. And they still start doing it, and the movement is growing. And let me show how it looks like. So this is the place. Almonds in a desert area. Every time, less rain. Every time, different weather events. More droughts, very, very warm. It was a forest before, when the Romans came. And there was also a beautiful grassland system. This is the place. It is big. And they have 100,000 hectares of almonds. Many of those almonds are non-organic and destructive because they till a lot. And they get subsidies. And the place is abandoned. People have left. There are no kids in the street. And the tourists are not there. The tourists stay at the coast. If you look at the Andalusian map and you buy a tourist guide of Andalusia, this place is not mentioned. They all go to Granada, Murcia, and Cordoba and all those beautiful places, but they don't go here. Because this place has been ignored, actually. So we started to work there, and we started to make the design of the maps. And look what happened after a few years. The farmers designed this themselves. The dark green are protected areas. The white is productive or unproductive land, almonds and other things. And the light green dots are the green corridors they want to establish. They mapped it out themselves in 10 years. Oh, this is, okay. This is how we do it. So we identified all the things we needed to do there, but in 10 years, more green, light green will come, and they will work on it, whether it's private or non-private land. In 20 years, they want to connect those protected areas, and they want to establish more ecological corridors. So they work now with other farmers and public offices to make this happen. And that means a lot of lobby, it means a lot of conversations, it means a lot of dialogues, it means a lot of convincing, of course, and also doing it themselves in their own farms. We are already working on it. We plant trees with some extra funding, with some carbon money and some grants. But something happened here, and that is fascinating. They also started by themselves with creating art. Because they said at a certain moment, they said, listen, if you want to restore the natural zone and all do this beautiful stuff, we want to have more people seeing it. Because we are proud. We want to be proud of this area. So what they did is they took a picture of an old cave. You know, cave paintings. They have a lot of cave paintings in that area. And they took the cave painting of a shaman. And they said, you know, this shaman, when this shaman was sitting in this cave one day, a few thousand years ago, he saw this beautiful forest, old growth oak forest, Encina, holm oak forest. We want to have this shaman being painted there at a 16-hectare area, not too far from the highway, and planted with lavender. And that's what they're doing right now. And another farmer said, wow, if you do this, I will deliver the lavender for free. And the city council said, if you do this, we will deliver the 16 hectares for free. And another foundation said, we will have labor, so we will plant it, we will maintain it. So that is an example that just happened. And then a German foundation said, and we put some money extra to it. So all these things just popped up. It was amazing. Look at what happened in the combined zone. So they started to map out 2 years ago the map of of the regenerative farms. Now, you know, in 5 years, only a few, but in 10 years there are more, and in 20 years there should be even much more. So the combined zone, or the agroecology, regenerative agroforestry zone with almonds, pistachios, lavender, rosemary, and swales and so on will be established, and we're working on it right now. Look at this. This is how it works. They started to draw the lines on contour lines to capture the water, to make sure that the holm oak trees will be planted and that the almond trees will be planted with other species, and lavender, rosemary in between, and rotational grazing and beekeeping. All that system just Pablo told us about. But then, of course, in a way based on a traditional monoculture of almonds. So they are transforming. And this is what is happening right now. Just an example, on the left, you see a 2 years regenerative system, and on the left and on the right you see the conventional system. So two different farmers. On the left you see already a little bit of darker soil coming up because of green cover. They have planted green cover. They started to slowly put it, in the soil, not with deep tilling, but on the right side still, traditional tilling and the whole chemical stuff. And of course you would wonder, what would the regenerative farmer tell the conventional farmer, and vice versa? Now, the regenerative farmer is converted, you could say. And the conventional farmer said, I think this looked like a mess, basically. That's what he said. But of course you need money to do this, and it takes time. And the first years we need to cover the cost, because there are no extra. You don't have more yield, you have less yield, and that is our challenge, to create more money. And then, of course, in the economic zone, the farmers decided to point out where they want to have more local production, and they started to identify the places in 20 years. Small cities become more vivid. So what did we do? We started with the first company, the Almendrejeza, and with the farmers, to make sure that the combined zone will be more green again. And the first almonds you already can buy in Germany and the UK. And we monitored it, and we showed it, how we do it, all these kind of things. And we also identified for the first time that we need basically 2 billion euros to make this all happen. Where a lot of money finally will come from the new impact investors and the new investors, but still we need public money and grants money to cover the first 5 to 10 years. So, what does it mean if you look into, over the long run, to make these kind of financial new systems work? You need, and that is the yellow under the yellow line, you need social money to maintain, to bring all those people together for many, many years, inspire them, celebrate, inspire them, do trainings together. And that money you need to get from whatever, from governments or from philanthropists to make sure that the machine is going up. The second is you need pilot money, you need grants money to do all those small things that will never grow if you don't put the right conditions there. And then at a certain moment, after 4 to 5 years, the first companies will start that are doing things different. And then the investors come on board. And that is the big triangle you see in the middle. And at the end, of course, you want governments to participate. And hopefully at a certain day, will change their political system or the subsidy system and work with nature instead of against it. So, give you some examples, some pictures. Here you see some works in the field, tree planting, water harvesting, planting of lavender, all kind of digging and graving to make sure that the water will remain in the countryside when it rains, planting trees, and some pictures of the landscape. And we do similar things now in Australia, where the first company was brought to the Australian Stock Exchange last year, and then we thought, we are on something. If we can raise commercial money with a holistic system, then we are able to work to push through the transformation at the landscape level. And more or less similar things happened in South Africa, where we started companies as well with investors' money. So we're able to do it. It's tough, it's hard work, but I think time is chasing. Time is ripe for these kind of things. And that's why we think we can bring the 4 returns up to scale, and that's what we want to do the coming years. By the way, these are some last pictures of where we work now in the peat meadow system around Amsterdam, where we started with a few farmers based on the same system, using the lessons of Spain, Australia, and South Africa. And we already have more and more pilot projects coming up, and more farmers are joining us in this movement. And not us as a movement, because we want to have an open access movement. It's not about us, it's about them. So, it is working. And how to continue? That is the last question. And that means we need to scale up through education. We have online courses now for business students, and we have online courses for practitioners. And our next step is we want to make this happen and make this framework available in a canvas for everyone. And that is what we're going to do, exactly what you said, in a systemic approach online, you could say an innovation platform. And that will become available within 1 to 2 years, because that is where we are now. We think that we have proven after 5 years that it is possible. We are now working in 11 countries with organizations like Red Cross and IKEA Foundation, and we see that, and Coca-Cola, and we see that we are just at the beginning. So please join us in this movement, all of us, because I think what's happening in Friesland is super important. You are already experiencing our lessons that a new language is possible, that an overview effect is necessary, that a long-term approach is necessary, basically that a systematic approach is the only way forward to come to what we call a regenerative culture. And in a regenerative culture, we need all these steps. And when I was invited for this meeting, I read the document of Panorama 2028. Last slide. And I was surprised that this document of Panorama Nederland 2028 was super, super good. This is basically all about a systemic approach at the landscape level. And I think this will be the new export model of the Netherlands. I hope it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Willem. Very inspiring. And of course, we want to maybe use this model in our own Blue Delta to. But is it difficult? Last question to you: that the situation in the Netherlands is completely different than it is in China and in southern Spain. And are the situation in the Netherlands? Can we get such a process up and running as well, or or because of the land ownership, for example, the way the system is organized, it's much more difficult in the Netherlands?
Now, of course, the more people you have within a country, the more land tenure difficulties you have within a country, it makes it more difficult. But our experience is that the Netherlands is, it is difficult. Yes, it's small, it's so on. It's a man-made country. So what is an ecosystem in a way, for instance? So we need to talk about biodiversity. But the most toughest thing in the Netherlands is that people don't consider them in a crisis. While we started in countries, Africa, South Africa, Australia, Spain, and countries that where the people who are living there were in a severe social and economic crisis that basically was created by an ecological crisis. And that was actually, they were so open for a transformational change that you couldn't imagine that almost all the shareholders of our Australian company were farmers. And of course some Dutchies and some English people, but especially farmers. Why? Because they are fed up with the industrial agriculture and the completely clear-cutted situation of that place. That place was a forest only 120 years ago. So all the ecological functions has disappeared, and then with climate change and a lot of things. But basically, the most important thing is crisis and the feeling of isolation. They feel ignored. It's a social issue.
Yeah, I understand it. A few questions then to finalize. Are there some questions for Pablo or for Willem from the people? If there is a finger coming up. Come in. Yeah, come. Marcia. I will keep the microphone myself.
Okay, that's okay. Well, I was just wondering, you were saying when the project in China where they changed the landscape and they used trees that actually didn't fit into that ecosystem, and you said that's not a problem. I was wondering, is that true? Is that not a problem? Because then we are restoring, then we are making, like you said, man-made restored ecosystems, but shouldn't we educate people more about the plants and species that actually belong to that soil?
No, you are completely right, of course, but the situation was that there is not a democracy. So when the scientists said we need to restore that place with Chinese oak species, the Chinese party said, how fast are they growing? And they said, not too fast. Basically, there are species that grow faster, like the American robinia. And so the Chinese party said, then we do it with the American robinia. But when I was there, I saw already some oak species under the 20 years old forest of the robinia popping up. And of course, we know that at the end, oak will win, because they are the climax vegetation. So it's a matter of time. If we come back there in 200 years, I think oak will win. But of course, you don't always have a choice. If we were listening to the scientists, we probably have done it in a different way.
Okay, other questions? Yeah? Koji.
What is the crisis in the Netherlands?
Is it a question for Willem or for Pablo?
Maybe you should
for Willem.
You should ask a foreigner. But Can we switch off the cameras? No, I think that it is. I think in the Netherlands, but in many Western places, and we can, scientifically it's proven. The more people earn and the more welfare they have, the less happiness they have. And I've seen figures where they can see that the happiness index goes down, while in many places the income will increase. So there is something there that has to do with sense of purpose. And I think the crisis is more about sense of purpose.
Yeah. Okay. Can you step forward to the light a little bit? Because you're now in the dark and that looks...
May I say something about that?
Okay, Pablo.
Yeah, because actually I don't see as much crisis as opportunity as a foreigner, right? Well, half a foreigner because my wife is Dutch. So I'm an insider a little bit. But once people ask me, is the Netherlands a good place to do organic agriculture or agroecology or things like those? And I said, well, I think it's the perfect place. First, because you have very good soils and a lot of rain, so ecologically speaking, it's very good for agriculture in general. but also because you have this culture of this, what you call the polar model or something like those, right?
We talk a lot.
Exactly. Well, you talk a lot, but you have a culture of coming together. You know, I mean, as a society, you had to come together to solve the water problem long ago, and you created those boards. And when we say that we need institutions to support landscape-level transformation, I mean, those can be already very good examples of institutional engineering that can support landscape-level transformation. So, in my view, there is a, culturally speaking and ecologically speaking, there is a lot of opportunity, more than crisis.
Okay. Last question.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. Then I would like to give Albert last question for you.
I was wondering why you choose actually Holland, and I'm addressing Willem Verver, because there are many areas in the world which have actually the conditions you as a despairing nation, as you described so very well.
Two reasons. One reason is that it is very good if you work abroad, that you can compare what happens in your backyard. And that's what we do. We bring Spanish farmers to the Netherlands and vice versa. And the other reason was that the Ministry for Agriculture, LMV, asked us to come up also with an idea to do this, to test it in the Netherlands. And we ended up, of course, in the most difficult system of the Netherlands, and those are peat meadow systems. And so that's what we started to do. We wanted to indeed to take up that challenge in the Netherlands as well. And now the great thing is, if foreigners come to us, we have a project in our own backyard. We can go to farmers. So we don't need to refer only to what's happening in Spain. And another thing is we can compare. And what we see, it is, you know, all the lessons we have learned in Spain and Australia, we can immediately use, because we talk about a social and social-economic and an ecosystem, we can use it. And we test it, and we learn from each other. So every week we have Zoom meetings with a lot of those farmers and people working with us in Spanish and whatever, and compare. And it is a universal thing.
All right.
Although the ecosystem is different.
Okay. Last words, Pablo. Last words, Willem.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for being invited. I think it's a nice opportunity also be here 5 years afterwards, and maybe in 5 years we see each other again.
Certainly.
So thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you also for the invitation. I think Friesland and the northern provinces are doing a lot of great things in this realm. So I think you can set the example for many places in the Netherlands and abroad. And it was also a pleasure to be part of his presentation. Because we've never met before. We only know about each other. So that was very nice. Thank you very much for organizing this.
Thank you very much for coming to here. We are if you want to drink, we go to the pub just 100 meters over there. Probably Judith and Janneke will help. I would like to ask us to bring us there later on, and a little presentation from Judith for our guests. And because we started up in the Frisian language, we have to finalize that as well. But then, especially with a farmer who's working in this kind of area, and Stuart is having Stuart Miedema, he's the farmer from nearby, and you can do it in Frisian, I think.
Okay. I was thinking a lot about how to do it in English, so now I. Oh, okay. Well, we are farming in Haskediken, and we did it all the way. We did the Plangasway. You know, the Plangasway, the full speedway.
What's the English word for plankgas? Full speed.
Full speedway. And then we made a transition to the natuur inclusief. And now I just learned a new word. It was nature-driven agriculture. And I like that a lot because that's what we do. We do scale down our business. We do scale down and make more money. So we sold off a lot of phosphaatrechten, made a lot of money on that. And we start cooperating with buurvrouw Dirkje. And buurvrouw Dirkje is making the most wonderful dessert. And I was just trying to sell it here, but there was no money. So I bring it in for free, and people had it for dessert after the nice dinner we had. And now I have some cheese. So try it. And we go to the pub. I thought maybe we go over there, but we go to the pub, I guess, and I have some cheese, and you just taste it and smell it and enjoy it, and go to the supermarket and ask for buurvrouw Dirkje.
Thank you. Okay. That was Stuart, always here, one of those tough guys in the field, trying to get it up and running with ecological and earning money as well at the same time. Tomorrow evening, for those who are interested, we have another meeting about biodiversity, and especially biodiversity in the food landscape. Teunis will be there, he's here, and Louise Vet tomorrow at the same time between almost 8 and 9:30. So you will be, if you want to join us again, please welcome, have a good evening, and for those who go home, bye-bye.